Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. This is Megan Jones, ICEAA's Executive Director, here to introduce the second of our 2023 Cost Challenge team presentations, this one from Team Augur. If you have questions for today's presentation, please put those in the chat, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. And I'd like to then just start by introducing Obai Kamara, Stephen Kolner, and Nick Peoples, who are going to go through our presentation today. Guys?
Thank you, Megan. Just wanted to give everyone a heads up that this is a video that we recorded for our team at Augur shortly after the conference. So we did skim through some elements such as introductions, which were less relevant to that audience, but this should largely be the exact same presentation that we gave at ICEAA. So with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Megan.
Cool.
Awesome. We'll jump in then. So thank you for that background. Today, our team, me, Stephen, and Nick are going to kind of walk through our presentation for the ICEAA Cost Challenge on what the cost of a human is. So going to skip introduction since you all know who we are, but this was our team that, kind of put together this analysis. So this is more for the judges as, we were doing the presentation. So as Sam mentioned, it's a very vague question, how much does a human cost? And as we were going through and trying to figure out how to answer this, we, really looked at this question in terms of who's footing the bill and why. And so we kind of went back and forth in terms of a number of different ways to analyze this problem. But we ended up deciding on looking at human costs through the lens of government social welfare. And so the reason why we chose to look at it through that lens is because we viewed social services as something that's tangible and measurable. And we really wanted to look at the cost from the government perspective to really limit the impact of risk, which might be driven by factors that are kind of lifestyle dependent. So, if we were to look at, how much it costs for an individual person and just funding their life, there's so many different things that can drive that. And so we really kind of wanted to bound that a little bit. So to provide a little bit more context on social services, at the federal level, the United States has been funding social welfare for nearly a century. And so these services are intended to provide for, kind of the vulnerable or disadvantaged populations within the country and provide them services such as, healthcare, disability, housing, things like that. And so, given the context of COVID and really the stress that's been put on funding these projects, we kind of wanted to provide information that's going to help these federal services understand how much it's going to cost to kind of fund a human moving forward. That way we can ensure that these programs are going to be sufficiently funded. So the first step in any cost estimate is really to understand what the purpose is and kind of bound the scope of our estimate. So again, for our chosen analysis, the purpose was to estimate the federal cost of social services at a per person basis. And we really wanted to provide insight on what characteristics of life in the US really drive these costs so that federal agencies can kind of identify risk and mitigate some of these risks moving forward. In terms of our scope, we decided to bound the estimate from FY 2024 to FY 60. And this is really driven by the data that was available to us. So we'll speak to this a little bit later in the deck. But outside of that, we are only capturing elements that are associated with social services. So since estimates are based on limited information, one of our first steps is really developing the ground rules and assumptions that are going to enable cost estimating. So as you all know, ground rules are kind of an agreed upon set of standards, which kind of minimize conflicts in definition. So really want to hone in on these and make sure that we're speaking the same language when we're showing this data. So main element I want to point out is that we define social services as public services which are intended to provide support for the disadvantaged. And we are explicitly excluding elements such as transportation, education, and small business. Additionally, we did have some assumptions, which again, we have to basically assume to be true to enable our analysis. And really want to point you towards the second assumption, which is that the needs of the U.S. population are determined primarily by demographics, economic conditions, natural disasters, and other regularly documented metrics. So, as I mentioned kind of at the beginning of this brief, we are estimating the cost of a human through the lens of government spending on social services. So, the team essentially reviewed the scope of 52 federal agencies and kind of using that scope determined 7 which we identified to be associated with social welfare. So those 7 agencies that we landed on are summarized in table 2.1a. Then from there, we needed to essentially organize this into a work breakdown structure that's going to help us kind of facilitate our estimating. So as you can see in the WBS at the bottom in table 3A, we mapped each one of these agencies to kind of a basic human need at that level 2, at the level 2 elements. So you can see shelter, health and wellness, and income and retirement are kind of the major buckets that we ended up mapping them to. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nick, who's going to kind of walk you through our data gathering and analysis.
Thanks, Eli. So I will talk about our data gathering process. You can kind of split it up into 3 main phases. So we started with the first phase being gathering that historical spending data from by year, by agency. So from 2000 to 2022, as Obi mentioned, there was a kind of a limitation there that we didn't have by agency, by year before 2000. So that kind of limited our data there, but we gathered that historical spending data as well as the population data, which I'll hit on its importance in a second. The next phase was then saying, okay, what external factors could affect that spending data that year? So for instance, Social Security Administration spending, what affects that? Well, probably the number of people actually collecting Social Security, the number of retired persons, or how long do they live, their life expectancy. So listing out any potential factors that could influence that spending and identify those as control variables. Then the last step would be actually collecting that historical data for those control variables, as well as projected data. I'll hit on in a second why projected data is important, but basically the projected data for the control variables as well as our population and spending data will help inform kind of our model going forward. You can go to the next slide. So you can see here this list of all of the potential factors that we came up with that could influence that agency's spending. So on the left column there, you'll see what's labeled as variable. That is basically just representing the potential for influence, outside factors influencing that year's spending by agency. Then on the right is actually the variable that we use, or kind of how we measured that potential control variable. All of these control variables were not necessarily used in every single CER and regression that we'll hit on a later slide, but these were all the different types of factors that could influence that we came up with. So you can move to the next slide. So here you can see some descriptive statistics in terms of spending and population data. On the top, you'll see the historical spending data. So total federal spending on the left, with specifically our definition of social services totals on the right there. So you can get an overall idea of the barometer of types of numbers that we're working with here to see what the spending data looks like. And you can see that social services makes up a large portion of the total federal spending year by year. On the bottom, you can see population data. On the left, you'll see the 2000 and 2022, the historical population data, to get a sense of what our population looked like in the past 22 years and then going forward. So projected population data, both developed by the census. Of course, historical population is imputed for year over year. Obviously, they don't record that every year, but every 10 years. And so then you can see on the bottom right, the projected population data going forward to understand, you know, what kind of population demographics are we looking at going forward. To the next slide. Yeah, so here's the graph that is basically a pictorial representation of what I just showed. On the blue line, you'll see total federal spending using the left axis there, so total in dollars billion. What was our federal government spending year over year? Then on the orange line, you can see the total amount being spent on social services. So like I hinted at earlier, a large portion of our budget is spent on social services historically and projected going forward. Year over year, it was roughly about over 56% being spent on social services alone. And then on that green dotted line using the right y-axis, you can see what that federal cost per person was. So how much we're spending on social services per person in the past 22 years. And you'll see this relatively obvious upward trend, right? So it is our job to kind of answer that question of, since we see this upward trend, how do we best mitigate going forward the expected increase in social services costs per person, specifically something like COVID, right? So you can see in 2020, we had a huge jump in social services spending. Well, things like that do happen, even those, you know, rare and unprecedented things like that can happen. And so we want to best help the government understand what kind of problems are they going to see going forward. Move to the next one. So like I mentioned earlier, something that is a kind of key aspect of our analysis here was not only, you know, analyzing using what happened in the past to actually project going forward. So we have all these variables, all these control variables that could influence how much each agency is spending year over year. I could tell you about how we, you know, projected every single variable, but we don't have enough time. So here's kind of an example of what we did to come up with projected data of what our demographics will look like from 2024 to 2060. So you can see on that bottom chart, it's the total number of retired workers the total number of people over 60 in the orange bar, and the people who are actually retired, so who are actually collecting Social Security in blue. And that number was roughly about 61% year over year, with very little variation there. So roughly 61% of people who are actually over the age eligible to collect Social Security is 62, or actually collecting Social Security. So then we took that 61% and multiplied it by the projected population data given by the census to actually estimate who is actually going to be collecting Social Security, how many people, not necessarily just the people eligible for collecting Social Security. So this is just one way that we came up with to estimate the projected numbers of what our population will look like to understand what kind of social services spending we expect in the future. We move to the next slide. And so kind of the last step, once we collected all this data and normalized it, looked at descriptive statistics, some of those graphs that I just showed, came up with our projection data. The last portion here was essentially analyzing correlation. So we wanted to see what was the relationships between all these different variables and how they interacted with each other, whether that's spending and age, spending and the actual population data, as well as all the different factors that we hit on earlier. Note, this is just a kind of a partial correlation matrix. This was done for every single variable. So this is just an example of what this kind of heat map would look like from -1 all the way to 1. And the other reason we did this in terms of analyzing correlation was also to understand what kind of potential multi-collinearity issues we would see. So I've already kind of hinted at it, but our methodology, which we'll talk about next, is can be heavily influenced by multi-collinearity issues. And so we wanted to make sure that we were mitigating those multi-collinearity issues when we ran our regressions to get our CERs. And so speaking of multi-collinearity and CERs, I'll hand it back over to Obai to talk about our actual methodology.
Thanks, Nick. So given the data we were able to collect that Nick kind of walked through, we determined that ordinary least squares linear regression would probably be the best methodology for kind of projecting the social service spending moving forward. So I feel like we don't really need to get too into the weeds. Most of you really understand what least squares linear regression is. But again, it's really a fundamental concept in cost estimating and is kind of the primary methodology for creating CERs. The main reason we want to use linear regression is because it's a technique that's going to allow us to model the relationship between the individual control variables, like the percentage of the population that are veterans or life expectancy, things like that Nick mentioned, against our dependent variable, which in this case was social services spending or whole life costs. So going to kind of walk through what that looked like at an individual level. So our team, we performed regression analysis for each department that was kind of listed out in that table 7 earlier on. So elements such as Department of Labor, FEMA, Health and Human Services. And so for each one of those, essentially we looked at the control variables, identified which ones would be predictive through that exploratory analysis that Nick walked through, and then developed multivariate linear regressions for each one of these. So as we developed those regressions, we reviewed the results, looked at the R squared, and also kind of compared the outputs against the historical data just to make sure that it made sense. So here's an example of what that looks like. Here in the orange, we have our regression for Department of Health and Human Services against the historical data. As you can see, it's a pretty decent match historically. But the last step there was also projecting forward and seeing, what does that regression look like compared to the projected control data that we have. So there were some cases where, our initial regression looked good statistically, and then you kind of look at the outputs in the out years and, costs are going negative or costs are ballooning to, crazy levels. And we would kind of dig in there and refine our analysis and kind of keep that going. So, this is kind of our primary methodology. And again, we did this for each one of the departments that we looked at earlier. So to forecast, the whole life cost per person, or again, social service spending per person, we essentially input the control variable projections as well as the regression equations into ACE, developed our point estimate, and then at that point we were able to apply risk and uncertainty based off of industry guidance at varying confidence levels. So with that, I'm going to kind of hand it over to Stephen, who's going to talk through the results of the analysis.
Thanks, Obai. So here we're showing the output of our model and analysis. But before I really delve into what's actually being shown here on the slide, I first wanted to take a moment to just recap our steps for conducting this analysis. So we had our identified scope and purpose of the estimate, and we determined that we needed to gather historical spending data broken out by agency, by federal agency. And then we looked at that federal spending by agency and identified potential control variables that might be good signifiers of how much money is actually being spent and why. Then we did analysis to determine which of those variables were actually statistically significant and good indicators of future spending for each of those different federal agencies that were classified as social services. Then we ran regression analysis to actually identify the fitting lines and develop CERs that we can use to project outwards these federal spending costs on social services. And then additionally, we gathered projection data for the relevant input variables. And then we took all of those and we coded it into ACEIT. So that way we could incorporate some sensitivity and uncertainty analysis within our estimate. So here at the top, we're showing the WBS phased by year for each of the different federal agencies that we classified as social services. So the two main ones to point out here are the Social Security Administration and the Department of Health and Human Services. So historically, those two elements are by year the largest proportion of federal spending on social services, and we expect to continue that trend outwards. In 2024, we're projecting around 70% of the federal spending on social services to be attributable to the Social Security Administration. And then by 2060, we anticipate that to grow to around 62%, or sorry, decrease to 62%. The Department of Health and Human Services in 2024, we're anticipating around 20% of the federal spending on social services, and then we're anticipating an increase by 2060 to 21%. So both of these elements are continuing to grow in terms of dollars, and proportionally, they both remain consistently the largest elements of per person federal spending on social services. And then this chart here down at the bottom just compares the historical spending in the blue line on per person federal spending on social services against the orange line, which is our projection. And while it might seem like we have a large increase within our projections itself, it's important to note that what's actually being shown in the orange line is actually, it aligns with what we've observed historically. So between 2060 and 2024, we're projecting around a 4 times increase in per person federal spending in then-year dollars, which actually aligns with what we've observed historically between 2022 and the year 2000. Over that 22-year span of time, we've observed around a 7.2 times increase in per person federal spending. And granted, that's a little bit overinflated just because those last few years are heavily influenced by COVID-19. But we do see a clear upward trend within that 22-year span of time, and that continues outwards within our projections as well. Next slide, please. So next, we want to determine what specific elements within our model are actually driving these upward trends in costs. And, you know, you guys are mostly familiar with doing a joint risk and sensitivity analysis within our models and developing tomato charts. Here, we did not apply probability distributions to input variables, so we had to focus our analysis of cost drivers on just pure sensitivity of the input variables. So this chart here is a tornado chart that only looks at the sensitivity analysis of the input variables and not with regard to uncertainty on those variables. So the orange bars here indicate a 10% increase to the point estimate. So increase the value of that variable by 10%, and then save the results of that calculation, keeping all the other input variables equal. The blue line represents the cost impact of reducing that input variable by 10%, saving the result, keeping all else equal, and then running through all the input variables in the model and organizing them in terms of total impact spread at the 110 and 90% levels of the point estimate. So, for example, the second most impactful cost driver on this tornado chart is the US population. If you increase the value of that variable by 10%, you're looking at around a $300K per person cost increase over that 36-year span of time. Whereas if you decrease the point estimate by 10%, you're actually looking at a $400,000 decrease over that span of time. So we have a little bit of an asymmetrical relationship there. The main takeaway that I want to point out here is with the top cost driver here, which is the urban population percentage. So that's the variable that represents the percentage of the US population which lives in an urban locale. And what's interesting to note here is that there's actually an inverse relationship between total per person spending on social services and the urban population. So as you increase the percent of the population living in an urban environment, you actually see a decrease in the per person federal spending on social services. And likewise, if you decrease the percent of the population living in an urban environment, you'll actually see an increase to that per person federal spending. And that wasn't an immediately intuitive result to us. So we had identified two potential explanations for this inverse relationship. Number one, as you increase the percent of the population living in an urban environments are population dense. So there are likely efficiencies with actually distributing and managing federally funded social services to people living in those urban environments. Whereas if you have a more rural, less population dense area, there are added inefficiencies that you do not get to take advantage of. And that sees an increase in the total cost. The second potential explanation here is that urban areas tend to have a much more robust federal social service program that is funded primarily at the state and local government levels rather than at the federal level. So the interpretation there can be that the burden of cost for these social services is pushed away from the federal government and more towards state and local governments. So that is another potential explanation for this inverse relationship that we observed. It is important to note that this is also the most impactful cost driver within our model. So if there was to be some sort of recommendation, how do we reduce per person federal spending on social services, that one variable within our model would be the primary element of life to look at. Next slide, please. Okay, so no estimate is complete without conducting both sensitivity and uncertainty analysis. So on the previous slide, we looked at sensitivity analysis within our model. Now we're looking at uncertainty within the model itself. So we actually had to consult the Joint Agency Cost Risk Handbook to learn how to best apply uncertainty to CERs developed from regression. And the agency guidance, joint agency guidance, is to take the standard error of each of your different CERs, multiply that value by a factor of 1.2, and use that as the standard deviation for an applied normal or log normal distribution within your data. So we went through our regressions that we had developed based on the data, multiplied the standard errors by 1.2, and then at each of the CER level equations within the model, we applied a log normal distribution with a standard deviation that was equal to 1.2 times the standard error of that result. And so here we actually have a relatively low spread. We have a CV of around 10%, which was not, that was fairly unanticipated just because, we observed at the WBS level and even within the historical data itself, wild swings and different deviations from the regression line. So we weren't anticipating to see such a relatively low spread. And we identified that the reason for this is because the two most impactful elements within the WBS, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Social Security Administration, they both are elements that are of high annual cost each year. They are the two largest buckets of federally funded social services, and they are both also relatively low spread elements within the model itself. So their projections are fairly consistent, and the regressions had little deviations from the historical actuals that we were able to compare against. So both of those elements combined, the high dollar amount and low spread, resulted in a net overall reduction in variance at the top level within our model. So elements such as the per person federal spending on FEMA is highly uncertain in the out years. There's a very high spread on an element like that because per person is such a low proportion of the total cost, the result at the top level variance is fairly negligible. And so we're left with a resulting low value for our total spread at the top level. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so lastly here, I'm going to touch upon some of the lessons learned, both from the analysis that we conducted and also at a higher level, what sort of lessons did we learn as analysts completing the ICEAA Junior Cost Challenge? So for the first part, the lessons that we learned from the analysis itself, to answer the question, what is the cost of a human? We came up with, well, the cost of a human is on average $51,000 per year in federally funded social services. If you looked at around an 80-year lifespan, that's around $4 million in base year $23 for per person costs to the federal government in social services. We also saw an increasing trend towards total cost per person over time. If you wanted to curb that cost growth in the future, the primary way to do that would be to look at the most impactful cost driver that we had identified that had an inverse relationship with the total cost, being the urban population percentage. So federal efforts to increase urbanization across the country could result in a reduction in per person federal spending on social services. And also, we saw that Social Security costs and the Department of Health and Human Services costs are going to continue to be primary majority makeup of the per person federal spending on social services, and that trend is going to continue outwards into the future. With the Social Security Administration specifically, the increase tracks with what we observed historically and what you would anticipate from projected population demographics. So we have a graying nation, the median age is increasing, birth rates have been decreasing over time. So the percentage of the population that is going to be older and more likely to be receiving Social Security benefits is expected to increase over time. Lastly, I wanted to touch upon some of the challenges that myself, Obai, and Nick had to learn while completing this challenge. And the primary challenge we had to overcome was the data and time constraints. So we had roughly 2 weeks to actually accomplish this analysis on top of our regular client work. And so we're pretty well strained to get this done. And it was a mad dash towards the end. And part of that meant that we could not spend as much time as we wanted to actually gather data. We only had a 22-year span of time for which we had, consistent data, and that's largely just due to, some of our data sets went back further, but the, overlap across all of the variables that we looked at was really just within that 22-year span of time. And so that limited the, the breadth of the analysis that we could accomplish. So we only had that limited data pool to look at. And so we didn't necessarily get the most statistically significant results. Given more time, we would have liked to gather more data and run more thorough analysis in order to make sure that our projections are correct, and then to also make sure we're looking at all variables that would potentially be statistically significant. Some further improvements to the analysis itself. The first, sub-bullet there really speaks to just gathering more data and spending more time to conduct the analysis. We would have also liked to broaden the scope of our analysis to look at things that aren't necessarily social services, but are adjacent to social services. So things like the Department of Education, the Department of Transportation, the Small Business Administration. Those are all federally funded public goods that are potentially related to social services, but they just did not fall within the typical definition of a social service. So those are not included within our estimates. They're just considered out of scope. Given more time, we would have liked to look at some of those elements as well. All right, and I believe that's it. Next slide is questions, right? Yep. So that was our presentation for the ICEAA junior cost challenge. So we'll open the floor up to any questions from the room. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Obai. It was a pleasure to go through this again.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. So we don't have any questions in the chat just yet. Everybody who's on, if you have a question, go ahead and fire it up. But I'll start with mine, and I asked this of the Quantec group last week. You guys said you chose to look at the question through the lens of spending on government social services. What other lenses did you consider before you settled on that one? Any that maybe somebody said, no, we couldn't possibly do that?
Nick, I see you're unmuted. Did you have a response? All right, I'm not hearing anything there. So we did consider looking at it through the lens of, how much is it going to cost to kind of budget out your life, and we kind of discussed why we veered away from that. We also tried to look at some other variations of that, thinking if we were to adopt a child, how much would it cost to fund that person's life through that perspective? And there were some others that honestly I can't remember right now. So if Nick or Steven, if anything else comes to mind, definitely speak up. But went through a couple of different options before landing on this one.
Excellent. Nick, did you have something to add?
Yeah, sorry. Can you guys hear us? We're just having issues with our microphone.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yeah, just the only other thing I wanted to add is we spent a lot of time focusing on the framing and scope of what the estimate was going to include. And so we initially looked at a lot of different options, specifically things that would look more like a budget over time. We decided to not follow that avenue. Just like Obai had mentioned, the assumptions that you need to make would really broaden the scope and it's unbounded scope within the estimate. So we decided to bound it just to federally funded social services, and that also allowed us to come up with a purpose for the estimate as well. You could frame this as something that could be provided to Congress or to the White House. They could use this information to curb or enhance federal spending on social services.
No, that's a really good, it's when we have this open-ended question that people can interpret it in so many different ways. And it's fascinating to see how you guys all, chose different points to come from and lenses to look at it through. I'll ask one more to give folks some time. So did any accidental data points make themselves apparent that you probably didn't use, but like, wow, what do you know? Look at that.
What do you exactly mean by accidental?
I don't know. Sometimes when you look through data, you see a correlation somewhere that you never expected. Maybe that's too vague a question.
Yeah. So in our analysis, there were some cases where we found more cases where data points were not statistically significant indicators, and Nick had talked a lot about collinearity issues within our data set as well. So there are things that were variables that were very strongly correlated to each other, but that was causing the end of the regression to be highly dependent on a single variable rather than a multitude of variables that are better indicators of forecasting out those costs. I can't think of anything specifically that came up as odd, but that was an issue that we had to deal with throughout the analysis.
Sure. All right. Well, since everybody's being shy today, I guess we'll let everyone get back to the rest of their lunches. I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank Nick, thank Obai, thanks Steven. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Megan.
Thanks, Megan.
Thanks, guys.